Fellas, the GOAT conversation in MMA is still massively debatable. Some people might think it's Jon Jones, some people might think it's GSP, some people might think it's Mighty Mouse, but the truth is, there isn't a single undeniable GOAT in MMA right now, so we're going to go through what every MMA GOAT could have done to be clear-cut, undeniable, #1 greatest of all time by the vast majority of MMA fans, and we'll start off with none other than Jon Jones himself. I'd say that Jon Jones is probably the most considered GOAT in MMA. Like, most people would probably have Jon Jones at #1 in their GOAT list, and it is because he's had such a massive longevity in the sport of MMA. He's got a record of 28-1. He's had a massive career with only one kind of loss on paper, and it was a disqualification. He also holds a record for the youngest champion in UFC history, 2 divisional champion, and he beat 3 generations of champions throughout his time. So Jon Jones is probably considered the GOAT, but the one thing that stops him from being undeniable, I mean, there's a few things, but I'd say the most important factor is the fact that he took steroids. So if Jon Jones never took steroids, I think he'd be undeniable. We talk about Jon Jones setting all these records. He also holds the record for the most failed drug tests in UFC history, which for the greatest of all time, how can you be considered the greatest of all time in a sport if you also hold the record for the most failed drug tests? This isn't just a one-time thing. This is a multiple-time thing where Jon Jones has tested positive for steroids, and it kind of stops you from being reliable in the eyes of MMA fans. Like, for example, GSP, clean. Demetrius Johnson, clean. If you're standing out for being a serial cheater in the octagon with those other GOATs, how can you be considered undeniably #1? I don't think he can. So for Jon Jones, I think if he never took steroids, he'd probably be undeniably #1. And a lot of people still consider him #1, but the fact that he did juice on multiple different occasions and sets the record for it is a very, very bad look when trying to debate about him being the #1 greatest of all time. And we'll then go to Alexander Volkanovski. Volkanovski's definitely up there in the GOAT list. Some people have him top 5. Some people might even have him top 3. Multiple-time featherweight champion. Great record. Great resume as well in the featherweight division. And he's just done it amazingly. I mean, look at the amount of title defenses he's had as well, Alexander Volkanovski overall. But I think the one thing holding back Alexander Volkanovski from being the #1 clear-cut GOAT is the fact that he didn't beat Makhachev and Topuria. I feel like if Alexander Volkanovski beat Islam Makhachev and Ilia Topuria, he would be #1, undeniably the greatest mixed martial artist of all time. Obviously, he was supposed to fight Islam Makhachev at UFC 284. If he'd have had the better half of that decision and beaten Islam Makhachev, he'd have been double champion on a huge winning streak, and he'd have been undeniably pound-for-pound #1 in MMA. And then to go back down to featherweight and face Ilia Topuria, which, as we've seen in his past couple of fights, we know how good Topuria is. If he'd have beaten Ilia Topuria on top of that, let's just go through some statistics of Volkanovski if this happened. He'd had a record of 29-1, which is an insane record. He'd have been a 2 divisional champion. He'd have been on a 26-fight win streak, and he did have 7 title defenses overall. That would have been fucking crazy for Alexander Volkanovski. He would have beaten pound-for-pound #1 Islam Makhachev, pound-for-pound #2 Ilia Topuria as of right now. So I think if Volkanovski not only beat Makhachev, but also beat Ilia Topuria, who would arguably the 2 best in the UFC right now, Alexander Volkanovski would be above everyone as the greatest of all time. And he's still in the top 5 in my opinion, but I think if he'd have got that decision win over Makhachev and got that win over Ilia Topuria, that would have done massive things. That would have done huge things for his resume, and I think he would have been the greatest of all time, undeniable. But what about GSP? Another man who a lot of people consider the #1 on many different websites because, you know, he had this massive run in the UFC. He beat everybody that he's lost to before. He's got a record of 26-2, and he's just had, again, similar to Jon Jones, a massive resume with a bunch of title defenses. He beats both of the guys that he's lost to, so nobody's ever beaten GSP and never been beaten by him in the future. He's also been a 2 divisional champion, and he is a long reigning champion as well. So for GSP, I think the one thing stopping him from being the undeniable GOAT, and he is kind of nitpicking random facts because I would probably have him as the GOAT, is the fact that he could have defended the middleweight belt. I think if GSP had defended the middleweight belt, that would have probably put him undeniable. Obviously, in 2012, he retired from the sport, and he didn't come back against Luke Rockhold. He didn't come back against Chris Weidman. He specifically came back against Michael Bisping, and this is nothing against Michael Bisping, but it seemed like GSP was smart about who he came back against. And obviously, beat Michael Bisping, looked dominant in that fight, but again, he didn't defend against Robert Whittaker. He didn't defend against Yoel Romero. By no means am I saying he was ducking those guys, but I think if he would have defended against a Robert Whittaker, a Yoel Romero, I think that would have put the extra stamp on his resume, defended the middleweight belt, become the welterweight champion, defended the welterweight champ too. I think GSP would have been the undeniable GOAT in MMA, but again, some people have him #1 regardless, and I don't think it was a crucial thing for his career to defend the middleweight belt like it was for Jones to not take steroids. Anyway, Anderson Silva, another guy. I'm actually going to combine Anderson Silva and BJ Penn, 2 GOATs of MMA, because they have a very similar reason to why they're not #1, but obviously they were dominant in their prime. Anderson Silva was so ahead of the competition, he made everyone look terrible, and BJ Penn, same thing, so ahead of the competition, looked amazing every single place the fight went. Both of these guys are some of the greatest of all time. Some people might have them #1 because of how dominant they were in their prime, but I think the one thing stopping both of these guys from being considered the #1 clear-cut GOAT is the fact that they went on a huge winning streak. So if these guys didn't go on a huge losing streak, I think that would have made them number one. For example, Anderson Silva obviously got knocked out by Chris Weidman where he lost the belt and then snapped his leg in the rematch, and it kind of all went bad from there. He had a no contest against Nick Diaz, followed up by a loss to Michael Bisping, a loss to DC, beat Derek Brunson, but then went on another 3-fight losing streak in MMA. And that was all it said for Anderson Silva. And a lot of people say because of that, he can't be considered the GOAT. And same for BJ Penn, who actually has the biggest losing streak in UFC history. I think it's him and Tony Ferguson now, where he obviously lost to Frankie Edgar, managed to beat Matt Hughes again in a rematch with Matt Hughes, then loses to Nick Diaz, loses to Rory McDonald, loses to Frankie Edgar again, loses to Yair Rodriguez, Dennis Silva, Ryan Hall, Clay Guida, and he doesn't even stop there. He gets knocked out on the streets, and obviously we all know what BJ Penn's going through nowadays. He's had one of the biggest fall-offs in MMA, so I think both these guys can't really be considered the greatest of all time. When they weren't the greatest of all time, they were the greatest in their era, and I think this is what stands out when you look at guys like Jon Jones and GSP. Those guys were great across multiple different generations. Silva and BJ Penn dominant in their prime, but across multiple generations they weren't. So I think if Anderson Silva and BJ Penn maybe had they retired before the losing streak, or obviously had the losing streak not taken place, I think it would have been fairly undeniable. Both those guys could have had a good case to say that they'd have been the greatest of all time in MMA. What about Islam Makhachev? 27-1 right now, and he's had an amazing career. I mean, submitting the likes of Charles Oliveira to win the lightweight belt and knocking out the likes of Alexander Volkanovski. And just look at this dude's resume already. I know there's a couple of guys that he still needs to beat, but he's on the huge winning streak. He's beaten some fairly good names at 155. He's pound for pound number one as of right now. And a lot of people definitely have him in the GOAT list. Some people might have him top 5, top 10, whatever you have. You've got to have Makhachev in the GOAT list. But I think the one thing that's stopping Makhachev from being the number one GOAT is the fact that, I mean, he's still in his prime. I think if he can go out there and win and defend the welterweight belt, there's a conversation to say that Makhachev could be the greatest of all time. Obviously, we've got Belal Muhammad and JDM taking place at UFC 315. If JDM wins that fight, there's been massive conversation of Islam Makhachev moving up and faces JDM for the welterweight belt. And if JDM can beat Belal Muhammad and then Makhachev can go and beat JDM, that's going to look massive on Makhachev's resume. And on top of that, like I said before, he's going to be double champion if he doesn't vacate the lightweight belt. He's going to be a 2-divisional champion. And some statistics about Makhachev, if this happens, he's going to have a record of 29-1, a 2-divisional champion, pound for pound number one, would already be considered the greatest lightweight ever. So I think for Islam Makhachev, if he can win and defend the welterweight belt, whether it's against Shavkat or JDM, if he can win the welterweight belt and defend that welterweight belt against another contender, I think Islam Makhachev has a case to not only be the most skilled fighter ever with the likes of Demetrius Johnson, but also undeniably be the greatest of all time, or at least one of the greatest of all times, because what a career that would have been for Makhachev. But what about Demetrius Johnson? Demetrius Johnson is another popular name on a lot of people's GOAT list because of how skilled he was in the octagon. Arguably the most skilled fighter we've ever seen compete in MMA. On a huge winning streak, obviously the greatest flyweight of all time. So many defenses in the flyweight division. Also went over to ONE FC and dominated that too. And he's just overall, you cannot have a GOAT list without Demetrius Johnson's name being brought up. One of the more disrespected GOATs in his prime. But I think the one thing holding Demetrius Johnson back, again, it's a bit of a nitpicky one with Demetrius Johnson because he already had a great career. But I think if he'd have become double champion and won the bantamweight belt, that would have made him undeniable. Again, it's hard to kind of look at Demetrius Johnson's career and critique it because he did nearly everything perfect. But he did end up losing to Henry Cejudo at UFC 237. I think if he'd have beaten Henry Cejudo and then done it in dominant fashion like he did before, and then gone up and faced TJ Dillashaw for the bantamweight belt and won that belt and become a double champion, I think it would have been fairly undeniable to not call Demetrius Johnson the number one in MMA. If we look at some statistics, he would have had 14 straight title wins. He would have been double champion. He would have had a record of 27-3. And again, would have been an undeniable GOAT because of the amount of, I mean, he's just dominating 2 different divisions. And then he could have retired on that as well, maybe gone over to ONE FC and dominated there, whatever he managed to do. But it's hard to kind of critique the career of Demetrius Johnson, but if he managed to become double champion, win that bantamweight belt against TJ Dillashaw and beat Henry Cejudo, again, some guys in the GOAT conversation of their division, it would have been undeniable. Demetrius Johnson would have been number one, the greatest of all time. What about Jose Aldo? Aldo in WEC coming into the UFC in his early career was massive. He was on a massive winning streak. He might have taken a loss on the regional scene, but apart from that, he was on this huge winning streak, dominating. And even nowadays, you look at his past 6 fights, he's won 4 of his last 6, and that one loss to Mario Batista was controversial, and the other loss was to Merab of all people. He's definitely one of the greatest of all time. Some people consider him the greatest featherweight of all time, and you've got to have Aldo on the GOAT list too, just because of the longevity and for the amount of how dominant he was in his prime. But I think the one thing holding Aldo back is the fact that he didn't go on a second title reign. I think if Aldo went on a second title reign after that loss to Conor McGregor, he'd have been one of the undeniable GOATs. Obviously got knocked out by Conor McGregor, one of the most popular knockouts, and then he won the belt back against Frankie Edgar. But immediately after that, ended up getting finished twice in pretty much much the exact same fashion against Max Holloway. And then after that went 2-3, getting finished by P10 in the bantamweight division in his next 5 fights. I think if he'd have beaten Frankie Edgar like he did, and then he'd have gone out there and beaten Max Holloway, that would have instantly put Aldo probably at #1 in the featherweight GOAT list even today. And then maybe even gone and beaten Frankie Edgar again and Brian Ortega again, 2 very winnable fights for Aldo at that moment in time. He would have had 10 title defenses, but would have been a 2-time champion. And he would have only ever lost to Conor McGregor of all people, which would have been massively impressive as well. Obviously, Prime McGregor being the only guy to beat him and him being able to beat every other featherweight. And again, like we said before, his longevity is insane. He's even winning fights nowadays in 2024 and 2025 if he beats Zahabi. So I think for Aldo, longevity isn't an issue. Title defense isn't an issue. Being good in your prime ain't an issue. I just think even if I had a second title reign after that McGregor loss, if he'd have beaten Max Holloway and then defended against Frankie Edgar again and maybe a Brian Ortega and then maybe retired, or maybe not retired because he's got longevity, but continued his career from there, I think he definitely would have had a better case to be the GOAT. But what about Stipe Miocic? Stipe Miocic, most regard him as the heavyweight greatest of all time, but I don't think anyone really has him as the greatest of all time in MMA as a whole. But he did go on a massive run in the heavyweight division, a bunch of title defenses. But I think the one thing holding Stipe back is the fact that he didn't really defend his belt enough. I think if he defended his belt 4 or 5 more times, he would have been the greatest of all time. We're talking about Stipe against the likes of Jones, GSP, and Demetrius Johnson, and everybody else on this list. Winning the heavyweight belt a couple of times can't make you the GOAT. If he'd have been a champion and then maybe instead of getting knocked out by DC, just straight up beat DC in all fights, and then maybe even defended against Francis Ngannou the second time around, and then defended against whoever else he defended against, maybe some other heavyweight contenders, I think it would have been the clear-cut contender if we saw Stipe Miocic successfully in more title fights, because he was an absolute force to be reckoned with. I mean, if he would have retired as the heavyweight and the guy at the top of the GOAT list, it would have been undeniable. But like I said before, it's the heavyweight division. The heavyweight division is kind of looked down upon compared to other divisions, which is why it's harder to be a GOAT in this division than others. But if Stipe could have been the guy to do it, defended maybe 4 or 5 more times, I know that's quite a big ask, but I think that's what it would have taken for Stipe to be the GOAT. Some people might not even have Stipe in the top 10. So I think if he'd have defended the belt 4 or 5 more times, not maybe taken as much losses towards the end of his career, he would have been undeniably the greatest heavyweight of all time, and potentially even the greatest of all time. But what about the other arguable greatest heavyweight of all time, Fedor Emelianenko? It would be unfair to do a GOAT list and not include the name of Fedor. He went on one of the biggest winning streaks in MMA from 2002 to 2009, pretty much unstoppable in MMA, just destroying everybody. He was obviously dominating Pride, where Pride arguably had better fighters than the UFC at the time, and he was, like I said before, arguably the most dangerous heavyweight in his prime. Still to this day, some people think he's the GOAT of MMA, so I think the one thing holding Fedor back, and I don't really agree with this too much, but a lot of MMA fans do, is the fact that he never became a UFC heavyweight champion. Fedor, like I said before, dominated in MMA from different promotions, from Fried FC to Bellator, beating the likes of Andrei Arlovski, Tim Sylvia, Nogueira, Mark Coleman, Mark Hunt, Kevin Randleman, some names that we saw in the UFC that he beat out the UFC, but he never competed inside the UFC. Who knows what him versus Randy Couture could have done, and obviously he went over to Bellator towards the end of his career, but he could have gone over to the UFC as well, and I'm not saying it's his fault for not going over to the UFC, but there could have been so many intriguing matchups for Fedor Emelianenko in the UFC. I think it would have been better for his legacy as well, because he would have been in that big organization, the #1. So I think if Fedor Emelianenko specifically became the UFC heavyweight champion, which I think he could have done because of how good he was in his prime, I think it would have made him the undeniable GOAT. Again, I don't really agree with this. I make an argument to say that the heavyweights in Pride were better than the heavyweights in the UFC at the time. But for Fedor Emelianenko, if he became the UFC heavyweight champion, he definitely would have been a lot more undeniable to be the #1 GOAT in MMA. But what about Khabib Nurmagomedov? 29-0, perfect record, never lost a round, never been cut, and just was so dominant in his prime. He dominated every single one of his opponents. It wasn't like he went to these very close decisions apart from the one with Gleison Tebow. He dominated everybody in his title run, but I think the one thing holding Khabib back is the lack of title defenses. Similar to Stipe, I think he needed at least 3 to 4 more title defenses. Now, he's not even the lightweight GOAT in my opinion. I think Islam Makhachev has already overtaken Khabib for being the lightweight GOAT. And you look at the likes of Jon Jones and his resume, and GSP and Anderson Silva, and how long these guys' resumes are. Khabib's resume is Conor McGregor, who fell off after that loss to Khabib, Justin Gaethje, Dustin Poirier, 2 permanent contenders. And if you want to chuck Rafael dos Anjos in there as well, you can do that. That is not an impressive resume. We could have gone on, we never saw him face Tony Ferguson. That would have been massive for his legacy too. If he'd have stayed and fought Charles Oliveira, who, as we know now, went on a huge winning streak, became the lightweight champion. Even as stupid as it sounds, if he beat Michael Chandler, after Chandler went out there and knocked out Dan Hooker with a ton of hype, and you can argue that he would have beaten all those guys, he would have dominated all those guys. but he didn't. You know, it's easy to say that Anderson Silva would have lost to Chris Weidman. Easy to say that Jon Jones would have beaten Dominic Reyes. Easy to say that GSP would have beaten Matt Serra. So I think if Khabib would have defended the belt 3 to 4 more times and maybe improved his resume in the lightweight division, had an extra maybe 2-3 years in his career and got a lot more defenses, which again I think he could have done, it would have definitely pushed him up there in the GOAT list. He would have had a much better record. It would have been such a smooth record, like 33, 34 and all. More title defenses, and I think he would have gone down as the greatest of all time. But then in my opinion, it's how every UFC GOAT, or MMA GOAT should I say, could have been undeniably #1 without any doubts. Let me know if you agree, if should have added any other kind of GOAT to this video. Let me know your thoughts. Thank you for watching.